As mentioned, my name is Leiv Marsteintredet. I work for the Department of Comparative Politics at the University of Bergen in Norway. I've been working with Latin American politics since 2004, starting out in the Caribbean, later moving on to Central America and also Brazil, Paraguay. And since 2015, I've held a keen interest in Venezuela and the ongoing collapse of Venezuela, which I will talk to you about today. I will talk mostly about Venezuela, but I'll try to link it in also with the state of democracy in Latin America, rule of law, human rights, because the crisis in Venezuela in part also shows the weaknesses of liberal democracy in Latin America. I guess my story will be a story of how the notion of a participatory idea of democracy cannot survive without the liberal component of democracy, without its protection. I'll link into some concept that was talked about this morning by Jeremy, concepts such as fake news, populism, but in Latin America it's a left-wing populism rather than a right-wing populism, human rights, the notion of the people, the majority versus rule of law or human rights, and also, of course, democracy. In fact, my interest with Venezuela started with the increasing gap between what we were told in the press by supporters of the Venezuelan regime and the realities that me as a researcher could observe. There was a story about almost a heaven on earth in Venezuela, but if one observed a bit closely, one would see that it was a regime that was entering an economic crisis that is now also become a social crisis and a democratic crisis. So in a sense, this follows a little bit up on what Jeremy was talking about this morning. I'll give an overview of, first of all, the collapse of Venezuela. It's hard to actually understand and grasp the incredible collapse of this previous middle-income country. So I'll talk a little bit about that before I give a short overview over democracy in Latin America and the developments of democracy in the region. And also focusing on a big shift in the politics the last 15 years. Then I will try to explain the collapse by basically pointing out what was the project of Hugo Chavez, who was elected president in 1998, both domestically in Venezuela and in the international order of Latin America. And then towards the end, I will talk about the unraveling of, let's say, the charade of democracy that was created in Venezuela. That is what has been going on from 2015 until today, where we have a situation where there are two persons claiming to be the legal or legitimate president of Venezuela. One belongs to the opposition called Juan Guaido, and the other is the heir of Hugo Chavez, Nicolas Maduro, who controls the state and the military. And then finally, what now? And then I guess we're open for a question about anything related to the topic. The collapse of Venezuela. I'll show you some numbers now, which I used to show this when I did presentations before with graphs. But it's really hard to graphically show this today because the changes are so vast and so negative that it ruins actually the graph. So I'll show some numbers where I'll try to demonstrate to you why we are talking of a total collapse of a former middle-income country and society. The inflation for 2018 was stipulated to be 1.7 million. We're talking now they're speculating, IMF is thinking that it might reach 10 million in 2019. Venezuela is going through one of the longest lasting hyperinflations that the world has ever seen. It has lasted now for about 2 years. Most hyperinflations last for 3 to 4 months, and then they are settled. This is a crisis that's been going on for over 2 years. GDP growth, the growth of the economy, is stipulated to be minus 50% over a period of 5 years. It will, after 2019 ends, have gone down to 65% over a period of 6 years. This is one of the most drastic economic falls throughout history. It can be compared to the fall of the Soviet Union and several of the countries that depended on the Soviet Union. It can be compared to countries like Syria, going through civil war, but there is no war in Venezuela. Its main negotiating partners has not fallen apart. This is a homegrown crisis. If it reaches 65% fall of GDP over 6 years, it will be one of the highest ever falls of the economy. The size of the economy was 334 billion in 2014. It is estimated to reach 89 billion in 2019. This is a huge and drastic fall. On top of this, in Venezuela, in the same period since 2013, the country has reduced its imports of medicine, of food, of other equipment by 80%. This is why today in Venezuela there's a lack of medicine. There's also a lack of food. There's a lot of undernourishment. The economy, the fall in the economy has a high human toll. Venezuela is an oil country. It was one of the world's biggest and largest oil exporters and producers of the world, compared to my own country, Norway, and of course Russia is a big oil producer. In 1999, they produced over 3 million barrels per day. It has been reduced to under 2017. Today it reaches 732,000 barrels per day. It's down to 25% of what it used to be. 95% of Venezuela's export income comes from oil. Now, these economic figures has a cost. Poverty back in 2010 was 20-odd%, 25% below the income line. This is poverty measured only as income. It has doubled from 2014 to 2017, reaching now 9 out of 10 people in Venezuela. The minimum income, which is what every state employee receives, a university professor like myself, for instance, is $3 per month. Now, this is an effect of hyperinflation, of course, because this is only measured as income. But 9 out of 10 Venezuelans today is considered poor or extremely poor. What do people do? They migrate. Venezuela is a country of about 30 million people. Today, more than 10% of the last 3 to 4 years have left the country. This number of 3.4 million, which is a UN estimate, it's thought to reach more than 5 million or more than 6 million throughout 2019. Yesterday, a UN representative working in a tent camp that had been set up in Colombia said that he expected that about half the population of Venezuela would eventually leave the country. And this is started out as the middle classes and colleagues of mine leaving 10 to 15 years ago. But now, if you look at pictures, people are walking out of Venezuela. They're walking towards the Colombian border and crossing on foot with whatever they can carry in order to reach Colombia, which is not a rich nation, of course. So people are leaving in masses. Due to the lack of medicines, lack of doctors, diseases that were eradicated in Venezuela. Venezuela used to have one of the better vaccination programs in all of Latin America. These diseases have returned. There was one case of measles in between 2008 and 2015. Since 2017, we have 9,300 cases. Malaria has gone up 10 times in a period of 8 years. It's probably much, much higher today than it was in 2017, because this is a rapidly accelerating crisis. Maternal and infant mortality, we don't have many figures regarding this, but in 2016, a representative of the Health Ministry produced official statistics. It had increased, maternal mortality had increased by 65% from 2015 to 2016. I underline that the situation is much, much worse today than it was in 2016. Today's crisis was only starting. Infant mortality in the same period, 2015 to 2016, increased by 30%. We expect these numbers to have skyrocketed ever since. So the situation is dark. It's really dark, and it's literally dark. This is a graph that shows electricity production in Venezuela and how big a percentage of the population that has electricity today. Venezuela's electricity is based mainly, about 80%, on one hydroelectric dam called the Guri Dam. Due to lack of maintenance of the electricity lines and the transformators, electricity went out in almost all of the country in March. 3 out of the 4 transformators that drives this hydroelectric dam are ruined. They only have 1 left. If that goes out, the country will be out of electricity for more than a month, probably, the full country. So we had periods here during the last months where 90% of the population had no access to electricity, which also transform into the lack of access of water and so on and so forth. So we are talking here of what I would call today a full collapse and almost also a failed state. Because the infrastructure of the country is basically falling apart when a former middle-income country is not able to produce electricity. And this is an oil state with a lot of access to hydroelectric power. And it is not able to produce or export oil, which is the main income line. So this is what I call the collapse of Venezuela. I try to put on all these figures, and there are many, many more, because it is so vast and so drastic that we haven't seen this outside situations like, for instance, Syria that has been mentioned, or civil wars in Central America in the 1980s. And even then, I am doubtful that we could see the same negative results as we have seen in Venezuela today. So that was the collapse. Now, as you can see, Venezuela is a Caribbean nation, which is one of the reasons it's close to my heart. I mentioned it's about 30 million people living there. I'll talk to you about during the last 40 years, 2 revolutions in Latin America. One is a democratic revolution. Now, this graph uses data from the Varieties of Democracy project, which is installed in Gothenburg, here in Sweden. It measures the democracy in South America and democracy in Venezuela. Latin America was in the 60s and 70s dominated by right-wing military regimes and got a democratic revolution throughout the late 70s. 1978, actually in the Dominican Republic, where I have lived, was the first country to democratize during what we call the third wave, which you can say ended with the fall of the Soviet Union and the expansion of democracy towards Eastern Europe. This wave started more or less in Latin America. And throughout the 1980s and also in the 1990s, military regimes would step away from power and leave power to civilian regimes. Venezuela, however, goes against the tide. It was a democracy since 1958. Its first experience with democracy ever was 1958. And when the rest of South America experienced brutal military regimes with Pinochet in Chile, for instance, Venezuela was a civilian liberal democracy that received migrants, that left Chile and Argentina and Brazil, and was a relatively well-income country due to its, later on at least, oil income, with a relatively functioning state. Things changes, as you can see, in 1998, more or less, when Hugo Chavez is elected. And now Chavistas, as the supporters of Hugo Chavez and revolution are called, they would quarrel with this graph and say that democracy was strengthened. And we'll get back to that, because this is a liberal notion of democracy where the rule of law, constitutionalism, separation of powers is included, alongside the participatory element of democracy, the right to vote, for instance, competition between political parties. Now, Hugo Chavez and his revolution would say that we strengthened participatory democracy. But what happened as well was that they started dismantling the liberal components of democracy. So, and this is the one revolution. Democracy in Latin America is a low-quality democracy, but it is still mainly democratic, and it has never been as long, never experienced such a long period of a relatively democratic peace as they do now. The other revolution that I want to talk about started with Hugo Chavez. Now, in 1995, there was no socialist government in Latin America. The only one was Cuba, as you can see in red to your left. Hugo Chavez was elected in 1998 and started what is called the pink tide, the wave of leftist government. The left didn't reach government in Latin America until around 2000, in part because it was seen as too radical during the 70s when the military regimes came in, and they lost a lot of support throughout this period. Now, in 2015, I've shaded these with different colors. The clearly red are the ones who call themselves socialists, the ones that have promoted what is called participatory revolutions, where new constitutions have gotten rid of the old liberal idea of democracy, and they have strengthened or tried to strengthen the relations, direct relation between the people, el pueblo in Spanish, and their leaders. This is Venezuela first and foremost, together with Cuba, but also in Ecuador and Bolivia, and partly also in Nicaragua. The other in orange there are social democratic governments in 2015 that accepts and hold high the liberal values that we recognize with social democracy elsewhere in the world. So we got a left-wing wave in Latin America, and that's the second big transformation that we saw in Latin America. I'll show you towards the end a map of 2019 where things have returned again. But Chavez and Venezuela led this revolution of the left, let's say, and was its most radical defender. And it is his project, I would say, that can explain the collapse of Venezuela. There are two elements to this. I'll focus mostly on the one that relates to democracy and rule of law, but of course there is an economic element of this as well. When Chavez got to power in 1998, he argued that liberal democracy had failed. We should throw it out. He used populist rhetoric and likened the components of liberal democracy with elites, with corruption. He distanced distanced these institutions, parliament, political parties, from the people, saying that these did not represent the people. He argued that in order to promote a better democracy, we need a direct, undisturbed link between the people and its leader, Hugo Chavez. It should not be mediated by corrupt parties, by a corrupt parliament, he would argue. So he had two dimensions to this revolution. One was the domestic development in Venezuela, and the other one was to attack or challenge the attempts to create a liberal regional order in Latin America. Domestically, he created a new constitution, which gave him the opportunity to throw out the old elites, the old parties, and come in with a new constitution that increased presidential power, gave him the right to become re-elected. This is a big issue in Latin America. Weakened the political parties, and it also gave him the chance to renew the institution that defends the rule of law, in a sense, that controls presidential power, renew the courts and members of the courts, renew and elect a new Supreme Court. And he won majorities. So it opened up for what he would call a higher level of democracy, a participatory democracy, where he, the leader, could embody the voice of the people, where there weren't any distinctions between the people, because whoever disagreed didn't form part of the people. This is part of the populist rhetoric, which is very normal in Latin America. And he was popular, and I'll show you how important that was. So he created what he called a participatory democracy, or what I would probably call a competitive authoritarian regime, where disagreement would often be likened with being unpatriotic, for instance. And we'll see here that this is the same indices from the varieties of democracy project. And you'll see that it's particularly the rule of law where it's registered a deep downfall, much steeper than on participation. Again, Chavistas would say the graph on participation is wrong. It should go up and not down. But you'll see that he attacked more the rule of law by renewing all of these authorities that could control power, which of course is the idea of constitutionalism, which of course is the idea of defending rule of law. His other dimension was the regional one. Now this is a map of all regional organizations in Latin America. You can see it's a mess. But the liberal order was defended by the Organization of American States, which protects the inter-American system of human rights in Latin America. It has its parallel with the European Commission of Human Rights and the European Court of Human Rights. And it is the institution that should also protect democracy. It has a strong liberal component because human rights has its own convention, the American Convention of Human Rights from 1948, and it has its regional courts that were empowered to protect citizens from governments that, authoritarian and democratic governments that would violate the citizens' human rights. Hugo Chavez created these four institutions instead, attacking this liberal order, because this international liberal order had a flaw according to him. The United States was part of it. Hugo Chavez's revolution was what he called an anti-imperialist revolution, but it was more than that. It was an anti-US revolution. So he created institutions like CELAC and UNASUR, but these institutions were more than anything else a chance for presidents to unite every second year or every year with the big diplomatic missions. They did not have a convention for human rights. They were not designed to protect the citizens against the states. In fact, these institutions were created to protect the states from the citizens. So if there were protests, we could see that in Bolivia in 2008, people protesting against their governments, the UNASUR would meet in order to protect the president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, from his citizens. So these new regional institutions were not liberal. They were there, first of all, to weaken the Organization of American States, but second of all, to protect the leaders from their people. So this was the international dimension of trying to weaken the liberal order of Latin America. I'll briefly also point out that the collapse I showed you has, of course, its political economical roots. In addition to taking control over the courts, winning power in parliament and winning the presidency, it was important for him to control the PDVSA, which is the national oil company, and also win control over the central bank. So Chavismo and his revolution was extremely popular, and that is because Venezuela and Chavez since 2002, 2003 ruled over the biggest oil boom and longest lasting oil boom in history. This gave an incredible amount of extra income that could be doled out to the people, and due to the extra income they took up a lot of debt with funds on Wall Street, but also increasingly with China, and this created an enormous popularity and gave them the opportunity to increase the level of corruption without harming the people. With such a growth, people were experiencing an increased standard of living at the same time as Venezuela could go on being ruled inefficiently and open up for a highly corrupt regime to oil the machinery and support of the government. Further, Chavez launched himself as a socialist back in 2006 and increasingly took control over the economy. Now, one effect of that is that it gives the state more power. In addition to, depending on how you do it, it could create inefficient economic results. I'll give you one example of how the currency controls worked in the favor of the regime and gave corruption. Now, the black line is the official rate of the Venezuelan bolivar to the dollar, whereas the blue line is the rate you would get on the street. So what happened was that if you see, for instance, in 2017, towards the end of 2017, you would need to pay 100,000 bolivar for a dollar. That's a lot. It used to be around 10. So this is the devaluation, the real devaluation. But if you had access to the state, you would only pay 10 for the same dollar. So he created the most lucrative business the world has ever seen, much more lucrative than shipping cocaine, which also the Venezuelan state does. You could come in with 10 bolivar to the central bank if you had access. You could buy a dollar, then you could go on the street and you can exchange that dollar and get 100,000 bolivar back. Now, if you have good access, you come back to the central bank with 100,000 bolivar and you exchange for a dollar again, and then you get $10,000. That's two exchanges. If you can do that a couple of times, you're a multimillionaire. And after that, you run to Spain or you run to Miami or wherever, and you ship your money to Andorra or whatnot. So this system, of course, took a lot of resources out of Venezuela, but it enriched and created an enormous amount of corruption. due to the current collapse, as you can see towards the far end, which is late 2018, the system is no longer sustainable, and we've seen a complete devaluation, and there is no difference any longer between the official rate and the street rate of Bolivar to the dollar. So, bad economic management, corruption, incompetence, ruined, of course, the economy. But I want to emphasize that this was possible because of the institutional changes made back in 1999, where they took control over the courts, they removed political opposition, and gave the president more power. There weren't anyone to control the consumption of the government. Having a politically pliant central bank helps if you want to steal from the state. So the institutional part is a foundation for the later economical part that came after. As I mentioned, one of the reasons why I was interested in Venezuela was because of the huge gap between the realities I could see and the rhetoric that one could meet, the fake news, the exaggerations. This debate could go on for so many years because Hugo Chavez was popular. So you got the perfect, let's say, tension between the liberal component, the rule of law component of democracy, and the popular component of democracy. Now, the rule of law is there to protect minorities often. It's there to control governments, to say you can't do anything you want. But the argument in Venezuela, and which I would meet in debates in Norway and elsewhere on Venezuela, was that, but he's democratically elected. He is popular. So the argument of the majority would trump any argument of the liberal notion of democracy. But the problem with participatory democracy is that it works with the notion of the people, as if it were a mass. And that can go on as long as you are the real majority. So Chavez organized presidential election because this gave legitimacy to his claim that we're a democratic nation. We're a democratic system. The majority has spoken. This graph shows the popularity of presidents, as it says. He organized election in 1999, had a 90% popularity. Luckily enough, after a dip in his popularity in 2002, 2003, he didn't have to face the voters again until 2006, when again he was extremely popular. He dies in 2013, right after the next presidential election, and they managed to organize another election in early 2013, which elects Nicolás Maduro. So as long as he's popular, we can have these debates going, the majoritarian argument versus the liberal argument. It was sustained by other parliamentary elections that were held when he was popular, and to further emphasize the democratic nature of the regime, he would argue, he organized 3 referenda. One was a recall referendum back in 2004, which Chavez won, and later 2 referenda to increase presidential power and establish the socialist nature of Venezuela. So the majorities of 2009 labeled Venezuela socialist for generations to come. Now again, you can hold up a participatory idea of democracy as long as you're in the majority, as long as you're the vast majority, but disagreements, exchange of arguments can only happen in institutions where everyone is represented. This is normally throughout a variety of political parties, or in particular through parliaments and through a free press. So the problem establishes itself when this prior majority becomes a minority. What to do then? How to organize political disagreements when you've designed a system where the winner takes it all, where you weaken all the institutions where these political disagreements between peoples can be expressed. The unraveling of this charade of democracy occurs when they have to organize a parliamentary election in December 2015. The crisis is already set in. The regime or the president has a popularity of only about 20–30%, and they lose for the first time an election. The opposition wins 2/3 representatives in parliament. With 2/3 of representatives in parliament, you can do almost anything in democracy, because you can change the constitution. You can remove a president. You can elect a new Supreme Court if you want. The opposition came in and sought to do all of these things, but then when this formerly popular participatory majority met opposition, there were no institutions there to manage these disagreements and these quarrels, and the charade fades and gets away. They organize finally a new presidential election when polls show that Nicolás Maduro is only supported by 20% of the population. The opposition boycotts the election and Maduro wins easily in what is called a fraudulent election. Because now they couldn't organize clean elections anymore to stay in power. They had to turn fraudulent. And this brings us up to today's situation of why you have two presidents in Venezuela. Juan Guaidó on the right, is leader of the opposition. They used the constitution against the regime and said that former election of President Nicolás Maduro was illegitimate. It was not democratic. It hasn't been regarded as democratic by any democratic nation, not the EU, not my own country, Norway, or the OAS, or any of the neighboring Latin American countries. He argued with the constitution in hand, saying that, well, the presidency is now vacant because Nicolás Maduro is an usurper. He has stolen the presidency, and when the presidency is vacant, it falls down to the President of the National Assembly to take over as interim president. So that's the argument. It's a classic democratic argument saying that when the leaders have defrauded the people take the power back and want to re-legitimize power through fresh election. So what Guaidó is saying, that we as the people take the power back and want to organize new elections in order to create a new legitimate government. So this is why we can see that there are 50 nations today supporting Juan Guaidó, and there are only non-democracies that today supports Nicolás Maduro. You'll find the supporters of Nicolás Maduro in Russia, and you'll find them in Cuba, you'll find them in Turkey today, but in no democratic nation as we know it. So, whereas this is a collapse of Venezuela and is a domestic crisis, the last couple of years it's become international. There have been attempts of dialogue where the Vatican has tried to talk between the parties, between the opposition regime. There have been implemented sanctions from the US since 2017, economic sanctions, which has worsened the economic situation. Since 2019, the US has imposed oil sanctions, which means now that Venezuela exports oil no longer to the US, but to China, to India. The OAS has thrown Venezuela out of its organization because of its breach of democratic order, and the region isolates Venezuela. So it's become an internationalization of crisis, but it's also become a criminalized regime. Whereas Chavez could support his regime with the people, with votes, with elections. This is no longer possible. The shred of democracy has gone away. And now Nicolás Maduro supports his regime with the criminalization of the regime by inviting guerrilla or terrorist organizations from Colombia to partially control the country, to run illegal mines in order to create income for the regime, because they're now sanctioned and cannot take up loans anywhere else. That is mining when it comes to gold, for instance, which is basically stolen from the country and sent to Turkey in order for the regime to receive money. So we've seen an internationalization of the crisis because the region is involved, but it's also become a battle between the great powers. The US supports Guaido, the opposition leader. The region supports Guaido, the opposition leader. But what Chavez also did when he ran was to create new alliances. He's allied with Russia. Putin has sent soldiers to Venezuela. Cuba has many soldiers in Venezuela. Venezuela is a big military partner for Russia because it's been buying Russian equipment for many, many years now. And this creates the great powers' interest. So what I think we see is a freezing of the conflict. With both Russia and the US involved, it's very hard to see how this can be resolved. China has become a big player in Latin America, and particularly in Venezuela. Venezuela owes and has defaulted on debts to China. China's official policy is non-intervention. They will not do anything, they say, which is a defense of the status quo and, of course, a defense of Nicolas Maduro. One would think that the situation today is unsustainable, but from having watched from afar through the media how we've said for many years that crisis and war in Syria was unsustainable, and we've seen it continued, it's really hard to see things changing. But I guess there are three potential outcomes. Donald Trump and his colleagues in Washington has talked about a US intervention. I think this is very doubtful because Russia has clearly stated that they're willing to defend Maduro. Cuba says the same. This is not a country like the US intervened in 1990 in Panama, which is a small country where the US was. Venezuela is a huge country with large military. So the tough talk from Washington, D.C. on intervention is not likely to come to anything else. It's been called a bluff. They said that after sanction we would consider intervention, but clearly now this is not on the table. What most people hope for is some sort of transition to democracy, a removal of Maduro in some way. The better outcome most people argue for is something orderly, a negotiated transaction between the incoming regime and the outgoing regime. With the criminalization of the current regime holders, which are involved in, as I mentioned, illegal mining, but also in the drug trade. Venezuela has become the biggest exporter, or at least shipper of cocaine towards the US markets now in Latin America. It's very hard to see that the power holders are willing to negotiate these lucrative incomes away. One could see a transition through what has been a traditional way of changing powers in Latin America, a coup. Whether that will create democracy is another question. The military in Venezuela are aligned with Cubans, Russians, and Chinese. None of the countries are recognized for being very democratic. So it's the outcome of which is very, very much in question. But if there is a transition, I think we would rather see it through a coup than some orderly negotiated transition. But as I mentioned, the status quo, which means further deterioration of Venezuela, further migration, seems more likely. With the big powers' interest and presence in Venezuela, it's very hard to see that someone can move this situation in one or the other direction. But this means that the situation, the collapse that I've mentioned, will only get worse. There will be no end to hyperinflation under the current regime. There will be no access to international loans under the current regime. There will be no lifting of the sanctions under the current regime. And we'll just see a vast increase in the migration and human suffering. I'll end with this. I've spoken for a bit longer than I thought. So what does Venezuela's collapse mean for democracy? First of all, we see a reaction against the left, as you can see from this map. There are three, let's say, social democratic countries left: Uruguay, Ecuador, and now Mexico. And the more socialist countries are more and more isolated. We've seen an increased polarization of politics in Latin America. The collapse of Venezuela has influenced elections in Colombia and Brazil, where right-wing and even extreme right-wing candidates have been able to use the scare of socialism against moderate left-wing candidates. So we've seen a polarization. We've also seen that the liberal order, the Organization of American States, the US, which sometimes supports democracy in the region, has been weakened. It has not been able to address the slow backsliding of democracy, where a president takes over one institution after another. It's an international system that is rigged towards defending governments against quick military coups, for instance. Then it can react. When it's a slow movement where democracy is eroded institution by institution, the liberal order, the Organization of American States, has not been able to defend democracy, and it has weakened then US hegemony in Latin America, but also this liberal order. I mentioned increased polarization. The region, and we don't know the outcome of this, the migration crisis is vast. In Colombia only, there's more than 1 million Venezuelans living today. Over 2 million of the 3.4 million that's left Venezuela are now living in various Latin American countries. We've seen examples of violence related to xenophobia. We're not sure how this migration crisis may affect democracy. It clearly affects Colombia and clearly affects their economy. So this is an open question, but the region now has to face a huge migration crisis that towards the end of this year will reach the levels of what we've seen in Syria. And if the status quo is maintained, it will surpass Syria when we come to 2020. So this morning we were talking about the glass being half full or half empty. I'll say that when it comes to fake news, I support Jeremy of the glass being half full. The Venezuelans reacted to the fake news when confronted with the harsh economic realities of their daily lives. But the glass is more than half empty when you see the costs that it took for both international observers and for the Venezuelan people to actually discover that their regime was based in part on the fake news, because the costs are tremendous. Thank you.